I've always loved, I've always thought that art is more than what's in a museum and that's in galleries. I don't subscribe to that. And to me, art is, there are artists that, you know, doing everything from like, you know, making crazy hair topiaries to doing advertising. I love advertising because I think it's like this mass communication, and now there's no advertising anymore. So advertising is kind of like a dead genre. But when I was growing up or when I was young, advertising, there were like these kind of genius people in advertising who were very radical, and they did, it was almost like public art to me. And there were these three people, all of whom I always, well, I wanted them to know each other, and they all, two of them lived in Greenwich Village. Actually, two of them live on 12th Street and in Greenwich Village. And one of them lives in Paris, but he used to live in New York. So the three inspirations for me was George Lois, who is this ad man from mid-century, and he was this outrageous art director, but he invented advertising that was based in ideas. Because in the 50s and then the 60s, advertising was really stupid, and they just would use like pretty girls and like type or ideas or slogans weren't even used. They were just like, it was just really idiotic, the advertising. And George Lois was like this young Greek kind of like insane character who grew up in the Bronx, and he worked at an ad agency, and he kind of like was so outrageous and came out with these ideas that he kind of worked his way up, and he finally ended up having his own agency eventually. And he was, my other hero is named Harold Hayes, he was the editor-in-chief of Esquire magazine from 1960 to 1970. And in that decade in America was a very heavy decade. It was when, you know, all the assassinations, Martin Luther King was killed, the Kennedy brothers were killed, women burned their bras, gays came out of the closet, you know, so much, it was the revolution, the hippie, you know, the whole revolution, the war in Vietnam. And George Lois is like super left-wing radical. And George Lois is this ad man, and he's just this wild guy. And he also did the first video. He used to do ads and videos for Bob Dylan. But he also loved sports. He was kind of hetero and macho guy. And he used to play basketball on 6th Avenue, you know, those courts on Waverly Place. He had this whole team, and it was all black. All his basketball players were black. I don't know where they lived, but he was like the only white guy, and he was a really good basketball player. He loved sports. Anyway, so through his livelihood, he started meeting sports stars, and he met Muhammad Ali, and he met like Joe Namath, the football player, and he just started getting these accounts, like big accounts for ads. Like he did this airline he did these ads that were like mind-blowing ads, like the best things you ever, for TV and for magazines. And his ads were outrageous. Like no one did ads like these. They were shocking. And so there was, Esquire had this editor in those years in 1960, and had this visionary editor who was like my hero also when I started paper. It was like my inspiration. His name was Harold Hayes, and he loved George Lois's work so much that he called George Lois and said, George, I don't have any money to pay you. I can pay you $100, but I want you to do the covers for Esquire. And you can do whatever you want, he said. He was like the editor-in-chief. You could do anything you want. So George said, well, that's, you know, it costs like so much, because it was airbrush. In those days, you had to take pictures and airbrush. It wasn't like digital, you know. So, but he said, if you promise that you'll let me do anything I want, he said, my covers might not have anything to do with what's inside the issue. And Harold Hayes says, George, I trust you. So he gave George the covers, and he also gave Norman Mailer like 10 pages, just write what you want. He gave all these famous writers. So it became this amazing magazine for that decade. And Harold Hayes died at the end of that decade. So it went away. But George Lois became very famous for these Esquire covers. He did all the covers of Esquire from 1960 to 1970. And he did things that I don't know if you've ever seen any of his work. Have you ever seen those covers? He did Muhammad Ali with the arrows in it. He did,
totally, absolutely, yes.
He did Marilyn Monroe shaving, he did these outrageous covers. They had nothing to do with anything inside. They were just pieces of art on the cover. It was very unusual and very amazing. And now, of course, those covers are all in the Museum of Modern Art's permanent collection. And George lives on 12th Street and was my hero when I started paper, because my first art director used to work at Esquire and knew him. And so he wrote, I was introduced to him when I first started paper. I was like, oh my God, this is what I want paper to be, you know? And it turns out that my father, who was really eccentric, my parents lived on 12th Street between 5th and 6th, and George Lois, it turns out, my father calls me one night and says, I think that guy that you like lives in our building. I was like, what? He's in our building? And my parents used to live on the 6th floor, and George lives on the 3rd floor. And so my father, who was very eccentric, started torturing George and giving him like paper sliding under his door. I was like, Daddy, don't do that. I was embarrassed for my father, because my father was crazy. He was like really eccentric. Little did I know, George ended up like falling in love with my father, and they ended up becoming like best friends. So that's how it was this funny parallel. So George Lois was my hero, and then I did articles on him, and finally he started writing me letters, and we met, and we became friends, and I've gone to Christmas at his house his whole life. And he's 88 now and not in good shape. But anyway,
but he's still alive. He's still alive.
Still in my parents' building on top. My parents have passed away, but he's still there, and he has this amazing wife who is an artist, and he's like my hero. He's amazing. He's a legend. Anyway, he has done many, many books that I love them all. But this one, so also the other part of it that I want to tell you is that Jean-Paul Goude, who is another hero. Do you know who he is? Jean-Paul Goude, do you know what he does? Okay, Jean-Paul Goude is another person who's like, he's kind of like was in advertising too, but he's really an art director artist also. But he's not an artist like in a gallery artist. He's one of these people, like George Lois to me is an artist, but he was never in a gallery or anything, or a museum. And even in the MoMA, they took his covers to put them in the design category, you know. But George hired Jean-Paul Goude as his intern. So Jean-Paul Goude worked for George Lois. And Jean-Paul Goude, he's the one that, you know, my Kim Kardashian cover. Well, do you know the original picture that it was from?
Yes,
you know?
yeah, of course, yeah.
That's Jean-Paul Goude. Jean-Paul Goude did both of those pictures. And I met him because George was my hero and Jean-Paul was my hero. But Jean-Paul was married to Grace Jones, and he had a child with her, and he would do these amazing photographs. All of them were analog, so they would take these pictures, they would airbrush them. He was very obsessed with Black women and just all together, all the different cultures of New York. And he did these amazing, amazing pictures. I don't know, have you ever been in my bedroom in my house with a woman with her legs spread with the ping pong balls coming out of her vagina?
Oh, yes.
Jean-Paul Goude's picture. So meanwhile, Jean-Paul Goude worked for George Lois, which is like the craziest combination. So I got to know them both. And then the third person who lived on 12th Street was Tibor Kalman, who's Alex's father. And Tibor was also like a genius. And all I ever wanted to do was introduce George to Tibor. I always wanted them to meet. But of course, Tibor was like a crazy Hungarian. And Tibor was as big a genius as George was. But his work was different. He was also, he did those Colors magazine, the very first issue.
Yeah, of course.
Colors magazine. So, and I actually worked on those the first issues before Toscani. But Tibor did those magazines. But Tibor loved paper, and he used to do ads for us, and he had these amazing watches and clocks, and he would he was just this genius. He was a total genius. And when he died, it was really terrible. It was terrible. But one time, George Lois yelled at Tibor on the street because Tibor's dog took a shit in front of like George's building, and George didn't know who he was, but he went crazy on Tibor, and they had this huge fight. So I could never introduce them. That was like the story. One is this. This is George Lois has done millions of books, but this to me is the ultimate book. It's called The Art of Advertising.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't really go in as much on his Esquire covers, but it does actually. It has some Esquire covers. I mean, this is like this is like 1950, okay, or 1950 or something. But this is like a vodka ad. Okay, can you see this?
Yes.
It's like a tomato and a bottle of vodka. So you know what it says, but I'll read you what it says. So the vodka is saying to the tomato, they're talking to each other, "You're some tomato. We could make beautiful Bloody Marys together. I'm different from those other ones." And then the tomato says, and the vodka's name is Wolfschmidt. The tomato says, "I like you, Wolfschmidt. You've got taste." Is the orange is talking to the vodka, and the vodka is saying, "You sweet doll, I appreciate you. I've got taste. I'll bring out the real orange in you. I'll make you famous. Kiss me." And then the orange says, "Who was that tomato I saw you with last week?" Anyway, that's the kind of like ads that he would do. And then he would do like, let me find the before and after, my number one favorite ad that he ever did. Whenever you hired him as an ad agency, like he wouldn't work with you. He would just say, "This is what we're doing. And if you don't like it, go fuck yourself." So very like so people didn't really like to work with him because they were scared. Only people that were brave would go and work with him. I just have to find this one. Oh, so he did this other ad campaign for television where it was for this airline called Braniff Airlines. And he would, these are TV ads, but he would put odd couples of odd people sitting next to each other. So he would have like Andy Warhol sitting next to like the George Foreman, like the boxer.
Mm-hmm.
Like they would never meet each other. And he did these crazy, inane conversations between these two people that were opposites, like Salvador Dali next to like Rex Reed, who was a famous like TV critic or something. You know, he would just, and he would mix it all up. And he loved Andy Warhol, loved him too. But he also did.
What year were those kind of ads?
That was like probably 1960. But like in the war in Vietnam, this is like Lieutenant Cayley was somebody who was in the American Army, and he murdered all these people. It was called the My Lai Massacre, and he was tried for war crimes. And George Lois put him on the cover and got him to do this.
Oh, wow. On Esquire.
So it's like he really went there, you know? He had him pose with all these like Asian
Vietnamese kids, yes.
And then when it came out, it was like, oh my God. And then he did this where he found, do you know the nickel in America used to have a buffalo of an Indian on it?
Uh-huh.
He found the Indian on the nickel. And he did a cover with the Indian.
No way.
Yeah. This is an amazing book. And then he did, those are just some of his covers, but I want to find this one.
So what year do you think the book is?
The book is from, oh look, you can only get it vintage. It's not like, you know, you can buy it still like on you know, at a vintage books place.
Yeah, an old.
Harry Abrams. Okay, it was published in the 70s, in 1977. So that was like after he did all his Esquire covers, but I want to find this one that I love so much.
What are your favorite bookstores in New York to go to?
I just shop for books online. I don't really go to bookstores, which is a shame, but I don't. I shop because I buy. A lot of things that I buy are books by people that I like. He did this. This was really shocking and got very controversial. The people at Esquire said, "George, you have to do a Christmas cover."
Uh-huh.
He's like, "You." they said, no, you have to do a Christmas cover, please. Harold Hayes begged him. He said, please, the advertising people are killing me because of your covers. We're getting in so much trouble, and we have to do a Christmas cover. So look what he did.
Who's that?
That is like Sonny Liston, like the champion who, beat Muhammad Ali.
Oh, wow.
And he is my hero. So that book is like my treasure, okay? And then Tibor's book, Tibor, I literally bought 100 copies and gave it to everyone I knew. I was like...
I have one too. You gave it to me too.
Oh, what it is, right? You've looked at it?
Yes.
I love this book, and I love Tibor, and he was such an inspiration. And I have many books about Tibor, but this is the one that I love the most. That it's just, I love this book. I love this book. And this is a book, this was John Waters' last book, and it's called Mr. Know-It-All.
Mm-hmm.
John is a really old friend of mine. I love all his books. I loved his book of Hitchhiking Across the Country. I don't know if you've read any of John's books, but they're crazy.
I know that one specifically, I remember. The Hitchhiking.
It's like his best book. His books are okay. They're good. I love them because I love him, but they're not like, but this book is the best book because I feel like now that I'm getting old, I feel like there's this last chapter that a lot of my friends are going through, like David Byrne, and he did like the best work of his life, right? And this was John's best book of his life, definitely. And I'm working on books. Hopefully they'll be my best books of my life. But I feel like there's this last chapter that when people get to be a certain age, and I'm going through it right now with myself, and you kind of are looking at your career in retrospect and what did I do in my life? Because, when you're young, you're just in it. You don't think about it. You're just in it. And you're working, and you're just not, you don't have any distance. But when you get a distance, and this book is almost like a summary of John's craziness, and it's hysterical. It's just like, it's good to read. I don't know if the humor if it's a certain type of person that would get this humor, but I laughed out loud in every single chapter. Like, he is so neurotic, John. He's so crazy, and this really is a great kind of portrait of his insanity, because he's OCD, and he's so eccentric, and he has very strict rules. He has rules, a lot of rules
for himself,
for everybody. He's the most unspontaneous person. He is you can't change anything on him. God forbid you change anything on him, or and then he's the most opinionated. I love this book so much. It's my favorite book. I bought 1 million of them and gave them out also. When I found a good book, I adore this book. And a lot of these books are all people I love and know. So, this book I also loved. And she's not as good a friend, but I met her because of this book. And her name's Tamara Shopson. Do you know her?
No.
Tamara Shopson. She is in the Jason Pollan school. She's that age. She was they're all in that. Her husband is, what's his name? Fulford. They have that place, Shopson's. It used to be a movie about it. It's in the Essex Street Market now. They're crazy family. I knew her parents really well. And they had this insane, her parents were crazy. The craziest people. New York, they lived on Bedford and Morton, and they lived upstairs, and they had this little store, and they would, and Kenny Shopson, the father, was kind of an R. Crumb character. He was really foul-mouthed, and he would cook, and they had rules, so many rules. You weren't allowed to come with more than 4 people, and also no 2 people could order the same entree. He had rules. And then he closed his restaurant on weekends, and he closed every night at 7:30. So he did everything possible to make it difficult for you to go there. But it was this cult place because he was so crazy. He had 100 soups. If you go there now and look at their menu, you'll die. It's like an homage. And actually the mother and father are cremated, and they're remains are on the shelf with all the food.
Wow.
He also used to go there. So Tamara, the daughter, I once had the opportunity to meet her, but the mother, they were like hippie parents. They were total hippies. And the place was like a mess, kind of dirty. And they had 100 soups on the menu. Like the entrees would be like, they would put Chinese food on spaghetti. He was like making up everything. It was just like, it was crazy. He was screaming and he was cursing and he'd be like, fuck you. I mean, it was, and then the wife was like the waitress, and it was very special. And they have made a movie that's really, really good. I don't know if you could get it on Netflix, but it's called They Kill Flies, or He Kills Flies. And it's about Kenny Shopson, and it's about the Shopson when they had to move, because the rent got raised and they had to move, and they moved in the middle of the street and they had to like get this dolly. I mean, it's like this whole thing. So meanwhile, they ended up in Essex Market, the old Essex Market, and Kenny was getting old and he died eventually. And the kids, the son and the daughter, they took over, they kept it, and then they moved them to Essex Market because they used to be in the old Essex Market. But Tamara Shopson, there was twins. She's one of the twins. And all the kids would grow up in the restaurant. So whenever you would go, all the kids were doing their homework there because that's where their parents worked. So they would just come downstairs, do their homework. And the reason why Kenny closed every night at 7:30 at night was he would take one of his children for a walk. So you'd always see him in the village taking one of his kids with a walk. That's how he had like me time with one child.
Mm-hmm.
Night he would go for a walk, and you couldn't order anything after 7:30. It would be like Kenny was gone. But this daughter, who was an infant, literally they were crawling around in diapers on the floor. And Tamara once came to the paper office because she was an illustrator, and my art director was like, "Oh, Tamara Shopson's in the back." I was like, "Shut up, I'm dying to meet." And it's a really long story, but I was banned from Shopson's. Everyone got banned from Shopson's at a certain time. If you did something wrong and you got banned. And I was banned from Shopson's. And Kenny and Eve were my friends, and they banned me. And then they kept saying, "You can come back," but I wouldn't come back. We had this whole thing for years. And like literally 25 years later, he told this friend of mine, "Tell Kim she can come back." It was like, but the daughter didn't know any of this, right? And I wanted to meet her, and then my art director came back and said she doesn't want to meet you if you're going to talk about her father. So I never met her. She wouldn't meet me at paper because they're all antisocial kind of and crazy. So Tamara has this book that's coming out, and I get this invitation to go to breakfast at Shopson's when it was in the old Essex Street Market to launch the book. And I was like, oh my God, I wonder if Kenny, I was so scared to go, but I just thought, water under the bridge. They invited me, I'm going to go, you know? And it was like a press event, but they only could seat like 8 people. That's all they could seat. It's like really small. Did you ever go there?
No, but that's still there, right? Yes.
Yeah, well, now it's in the new Essex Market, but they have a lot of on the menu, a lot of vegan stuff. But anyway, I went, and thank God the father wasn't there because I was scared he would see me and start screaming at me. But it was just Tamara, and then we all got books. She gave me this book because we were press. I was still paper. And I said to her, I went up to her, I said, I was banned from Shopson's. And she looked at me, she was like, "Oh, really? What did you do?" I said, "Oh, it's a long story. Someday I'll tell you." So she gave me the book, and I said, "Do you need any help?" I said, "I love your father. I'm sorry." Her father had already died. So I said, "I'm really sorry." And her mother died too. They both died. And she's like a very kind of contrarian also girl, this girl, Tamara Shopson. And this book, I went home and started reading it, and I was like, oh my God, this is like the best book, because it was about her growing up in this restaurant. It was about her parents. And there was this one chapter that was actually about the incident that was the reason why I got banned. And she didn't know. And I read it, and I emailed her. I said, "This is like my favorite book. I love this book so much." And then I read half of it. I said, "I can't wait till tomorrow. I can read the other half." And the second half, there's a whole chapter dedicated to the reason why I was banned. But it didn't mention my name. So she didn't have any idea. She just knew her father freaked out because you weren't allowed to ever write about shops, and that was one of the rules. No press. You were not allowed ever to write about shops. And we knew that. I always knew that. And I had paper. It was in my house. It was really like a zine, you know, in those days. And I used to go there all the time. We were friends with Kenny and Eve. That was the mother and the father and all their millions of children. And so this writer who was writing for the New Yorker, like a really good writer, said, oh, I want to do a piece on Shopsons for Christmas. I was like, I'm sorry, you can't do it. You're not allowed to write about Shopsons. So then he came back the next day and he said, I want to do a story. I have an idea. I want to do a story. I won't mention that it's Shopsons. I won't say the name. I won't even say where it is. I won't have any clue of what this restaurant is called or where it is, so no one will know. But I just want to write that there exists this place somewhere in the universe. So I thought about it. I was like, okay, that sounds okay. You could do that. So he wrote this article, and it was literally like this abstract fiction writing, but it was like there exists this place, and they have Thanksgiving dinner every day, because Shopsons always have Thanksgiving dinner on the menu. You could get it every day of the year. And then they would put it on a sandwich. You could even have Thanksgiving dinner sandwich. Like, the menu is amazing. And I'll send you a picture of the menu. It's amazing. But Kenny, it came out, and I really didn't even think he would. I mean, it didn't mention what city it was. It didn't even say it was in New York. It didn't say anything. Just said that there was this place, and people would come, and they had 100 soups, and then they had Thanksgiving dinner every day, and it was served with buckets of gravy on it. Anyway, I walk in with this businessman that I was trying to get a column from at this magazine, Traveler. They called me. They wanted me to do a column, and it was going to pay my rent. And so the editor-in-chief came from London and said, they told me, take him somewhere he would never go, right? Show him something because that's what my column was supposed to be like, to take people places they would never go. So I said, oh, I know where. I'll take him to Shopsons. So me and this guy and my ex-partner, David, he was wearing a suit, a three-piece suit from England, like a really straight, Harold, what was his name? He was a really famous editor. It was Tina Brown's husband. I forget, it was Harold something. We walk into Shopsons, and I was like, hi, Eve, do you have a table for 3? And she comes out, she says, screams across the restaurant, no, we don't have a fucking table for 3 because some fucking asshole wrote it up in a fucking magazine. So now you can't even get a table. I was like, and that was Kenny screaming from the kitchen. And then he's like, fuck you, like this, in front of everybody. And this guy in a suit, right, from the Traveler magazine that was going to hire me. And it was I was like, Kenny, we didn't even mention anything. We didn't even say your name. We didn't even say what city it's in. He's like, fuck you. Everyone knew, fuck you. So he tortured us. I sat down. They gave me a table, but she said, you're in the doghouse, but you can sit at this table with this other person. Turns out it was Amy Arbus, Diana Arbus's daughter. She made us sit with Diana Arbus's daughter. And then the waitress comes up. There was only one waitress. She was pregnant. And then she was always pregnant. And then she said, you're in the doghouse. You can only order hamburgers, and you have to eat them in the bathroom. That's what she said. That's what she said to us.
That's what you end up doing? You ate it in the bathroom?
This is with this guy from England who's a really big hotshot, like editor-in-chief of Traveler. And I was trying to I was just dying. I was so young too. It was a long time. It was in 1985. It was a long time ago. And I was so horrified. I don't know what we did. We got out of there, and I never went back. And I was I felt like I was banned. He didn't say you can never come back, but I was so freaked out. I never went back there. Never went back there. I was banned. But meanwhile, in Tamara's book, in the second half, there is a chapter, and I never understood, but I just said he's crazy. I thought he was crazy for banning me. But there's a chapter here, and it's called Buckets of Gravy. And she wrote about this review that came out, which you're not allowed to do, and how it said buckets of gravy that the Thanksgiving dinner came with buckets of gravy, and her father completely flipped out because it said buckets of gravy, and he became totally paranoid, and that was like his favorite dish. And every time he served the dish from then on, he said, is there too much gravy? He was obsessed with having too much gravy on this. And he was so OCD about it that he finally like took it off the menu. And she wrote a whole chapter on it. So I called up Tamara, this girl. I didn't even really know her. I said, you're going to die. But guess what? The buckets of gravy ran in paper. That was in paper. I told her the whole story. So that's another, but this story is an amazing story about this family and these crazy parents who had this little store that was like a deli on Bedford and Morton in the West Village in like, the early days, and how they turned it into this little crazy restaurant, and it was a cult restaurant, and what it was like growing up there. And it's a wonderful book. So this book is another one of my favorite books. And then my last favorite book, this book is amazing, and she's not a friend of mine, Roz Chast. Do you know who Roz Chast is? She is an illustrator. She does cartoons for the New Yorker. She's amazing. But she did this book. It's called Can't We Talk About Something More Pleasant? And it's about her parents dying. And my parents were dying. Like in the past 10 years, I lost both my parents. And when your parents die, it's like a whole thing. And everybody has their different experience with their parents dying, but it's just something that, like, I'm a certain age, so everyone I knew was going through it at the same time, because all my friends that were my age were going through it. And now, but it's like she wrote this book, but it's a cartoon book. It's all cartoons, and it's about her mother and father and how, when they got dementia. I mean, and it's a comedy. It's like hysterical. It's so good. And I read this book when my parents were dying. My father died first. He died in 2010, and my mother died 3 years ago. But after my father died, I read this book, and it was like the best book. This book was such a good book. It's probably only relevant to people who are like, whose parents are dying or like going to die soon or whatever for older people. But it's like one of my favorite books because her parents didn't want to talk about it, and they were like and they didn't want to move to a place. It's a whole thing. Do you want to try and get them help? And it's like a whole thing. But this is like one of the funniest books. It's like a comedy. It's so hysterical. This girl, Roz Chast, she's like a really famous comedian, like comic illustrator.
Cool.
Yeah. And I'm sure, like, Jason loved her too. She's like a hero to a lot of the older illustrators. Yeah. So those are my books.
What's your earliest memory of like getting into book, like getting a book and being like, oh my God, is this like just understanding the books was something else more than just what you had to read for school?
Well, and I like to read too, but my sister, Lori, who's my sister, she was always a book person. I was always a visual person, not a word person. My sister was always a word person, and she was really smart. She went to Yale. She used to make books, and she ended up working for Viking Penguin or HarperCollins. Then she went to HarperCollins. She was like a really high up. She had her own imprint. She was the editor of a whole imprint. And I actually did a paper book with HarperCollins, and she wasn't my editor, but she loved books. She was like a book fanatic, and she collected books, first editions. And my parents, we used to go to Martha's Vineyard for our vacations in the summer. And it was just before cell phones and everything. So, I play Scrabble with my mother. My mother and I love Scrabble, and I do crossword puzzles. Those are my favorite things. And my sister knows my taste in books, and she would always gather books from whatever publisher she would work at. Like, when I'm reading, I don't like to work. I don't want it to be work. Okay. So I don't really love, I like a story. I like it to be compelling. I love it to be funny, or I love it to be like, compelling, or like a wonderful story. I love it to take me on a vacation, books, and those are just word books, not picture books. I mean, I don't really love picture books, even though a lot of these are visual, but she would always edit for me, and she'd always give me a stack of these amazing books that I never would get for myself, and I would read them. I would read a book a day on the vineyard. That was
Oh,
my thing.
wow.
I would read one book every day, and I would go through, like, I'd always stay for like 2 weeks probably, and I would read 12 or 14 books in those 2 weeks. And for some reason, when I would come back to New York, I couldn't read. It was too much going on here. I couldn't like concentrate. But in the vineyard, that's all I did was read voraciously. I loved it. And I read my very favorite book, which I thought of including here, and I couldn't find a copy, but it didn't fit into this crowd here, but it's called Amazon. It was a wonderful book that my sister got me.
What's it called?
Amazon Beaming, like beam, like send a beam to someone, Beaming. And it was a book about this National Geographic photographer who went to Africa to find the, is the Amazon in South America? Where's the Amazon? In South America.
South America, yeah.
Went to South America to find the source of the Amazon River. For National Geographic, he was a photographer, and they took a little airplane, and the airplane kind of had trouble. It got like engine trouble, and so the pilot had to go get it fixed and left him in the jungle, and then he got lost in the jungle. The photographer, like, he saw some of these people. All of a sudden there was like these natives that were there, but they were like it was in the middle of nowhere. They kind of did a crash landing in a river, and he ended up being there for like 6 months until they found him. And he wrote this book. It's a true story. It's like a wonderful book. It was one of my favorite books. So it's Amazon Beam. It's a good book.
I'll look into it. Okay. Thank you so much.